Nobody was supposed to find DNA on a piece of cloth that the entire scientific establishment had already declared a medieval forgery. The carbon dating was done. The verdict was delivered. The case was closed in 1988, sealed by 3 of the most respected radiocarbon laboratories on Earth, all of them in agreement that the Shroud of Turin was made somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. Not ancient, not 1st century, not the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, just a very old fake. That was supposed to be the end of it. Every textbook said so. Every documentary said so. Every headline written about the Shroud after 1988 opened with the same 3 words: medieval forgery confirmed. Then, a team of geneticists extracted DNA from the cloth's fibers and sequenced it using technology that did not exist when the carbon dating was performed. What came back did not just reopen the case, it detonated the foundation the case had been built on. The genetic sequences did not match any expected population, not medieval European handlers, not Italian restorers, not the monks who venerated it for centuries. The DNA told a story that nobody in that laboratory was prepared to hear. And the man who has spent more time studying this cloth than any living human, a Jewish photographer who went to Turin in 1978 expecting to debunk a Christian relic and instead spent the next 46 years trying to explain what he could not, looked at the DNA report and said 5 words that changed everything. This is what he found. And this is why the Shroud of Turin just became the most dangerous artifact on Earth. Barrie Schwortz is not a priest, he is not a theologian, he is not a Christian, he is a Jewish photographer from Los Angeles who was born in 1946, served in the Navy, graduated from the Brooks Institute of Photography, and built a career doing the kind of precise, technical documentation work that requires an obsessive attention to detail and zero tolerance for ambiguity. In 1977, a colleague named Don Davin called him and asked what he knew about the Shroud of Turin. Schwartz laughed out loud. He reminded Devin that they were both Jewish. He had zero interest in Christian relics, zero investment in whether a piece of cloth was authentic or fake, and zero expectation that the project would be anything more than a week-long photography assignment in Italy. He agreed to join the team as the official documenting photographer. His job was simple: photograph every test, every sample, every analysis, create the permanent visual record, stay objective, let the evidence speak for itself. The team he joined was not a group of religious enthusiasts hoping to prove a miracle. The Shroud of Turin Research Project, known as STURP, assembled over 30 scientists from institutions including Los Alamos National Laboratory, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the Air Force Academy, and multiple major universities. The team included physicists, chemists, forensic pathologists, optical specialists, and biophysicists. 3 of the members were Jewish. The group was united by scientific curiosity, not a religious agenda. In October 1978, they were granted something that had never been offered before and has never been offered since: 5 days and nights of unlimited, unrestricted, hands-on access to the Shroud of Turin, 120 continuous hours with the cloth, conducting every non-destructive test the technology of the era could produce. Schwartz expected to spend 5 days photographing scientists as they methodically proved the shroud was painted. He expected to go home, file his images, and move on to the next assignment. He did not go home. He never moved on. And what he saw during those 5 days kept him working on this single artifact for the next 46 years of his life. The first thing Schwartz noticed was that the image was not painted. He knew what paint looked like under magnification. He had photographed painted surfaces hundreds of times. Paint leaves brush strokes. It deposits pigment in layers. It penetrates fabric through capillary action. The shroud image had none of that. Under magnification, the image appeared to be formed by discoloration of only the topmost fibers of the linen. Not the interior fibers, not the reverse side, just the outermost surface, affecting a layer so thin it measured between 200 and 600 nanometers. For reference, a human hair is roughly 70,000 nanometers wide. The image existed in a layer thinner than a single bacterium. No known painting, dyeing, or staining technique from any era in human history creates images this superficial. Every method of applying color to fabric penetrates deeper than 600 nanometers, every one. Then Schwartz documented the photographic negative property. When he processed his photographs in the darkroom, the body image on the shroud appeared as a positive in his negatives. This meant the shroud image was itself already a negative. Areas that should be light appeared dark on the cloth. Areas that should be dark appeared light. The image only made full visual sense when it was photographically reversed. Photography was invented in the 1820s. If the shroud was forged in the 1300s, as the carbon dating later claimed, then a medieval forger created an image that only becomes fully coherent through a technology that would not exist for another 5 centuries. Nobody in 1350 knew what a photographic negative was. Nobody could have designed one deliberately, and nobody has ever explained how one ended up on this cloth by accident. But the finding that genuinely rattled the STURP team was the 3-dimensional information. In 1976, researchers ran photographs of the shroud through a VP8 image analyzer, a device built for NASA that converts image intensity into 3-dimensional relief. Normal photographs and paintings, when processed through the VP8, produce distorted garbage. The shroud image converted into a coherent, anatomically accurate 3-dimensional relief of a human body. This meant the image contained spatial data. The darkness of each point on the image corresponded to the distance between the cloth and the body surface at that point. Areas closer to the body were darker, and areas farther away were lighter. The image was not recording light the way a photograph does, it was recording proximity, distance from the cloth to the skin encoded across every fiber. No artistic technique, no photographic process, no known mechanism of image formation creates distance-mapped 3-dimensional data in a 2-dimensional surface. The STURP team tested every possibility: paint, dye, acid, heat, radiation, vapor, contact transfer. Nothing replicated all of the shroud's properties simultaneously. After 120 hours of testing and over 250,000 man-hours of subsequent data analysis, STURP published its conclusion in peer-reviewed journals. The shroud image is that of a real human form, a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. They could not explain what it was. They could only say with certainty what it was not. Schwartz went home with his photographs and his confusion. He had walked into Turin expecting a forgery. He walked out with data that eliminated forgery as an explanation and no alternative that made sense. In 1988, the Vatican authorized radiocarbon dating of the shroud. Small samples were cut from a single corner and sent to 3 independent laboratories: Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. All 3 returned the same result. The linen dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD medieval. Case closed. The announcement was treated as definitive. Headlines declared the shroud a proven fake. The scientific community moved on. The public lost interest. The most studied artifact in history was filed under solved and largely forgotten by mainstream science. But Schwartz did not move on. He could not. The carbon dating result contradicted everything the STURP data had shown about the image itself. If the cloth was medieval, then how was the image created? No one had an answer. No one has an answer now. Not a single researcher, in the nearly 4 decades since the dating was performed, has successfully replicated all of the shroud's image properties using any technique, medieval or modern. And then the dating methodology itself came under scrutiny. The samples had been taken from a single corner, the most handled, most repaired, most contaminated edge of the entire cloth. In 2005, Los Alamos chemist Raymond Rogers published a paper in the peer-reviewed journal Thermochimica Acta, demonstrating that the corner used for dating contained cotton fibers interwoven with the linen, fibers that were chemically distinct from the main body of the cloth. Rogers concluded that the radiocarbon sample was not representative of the shroud as a whole. The dating did not prove the shroud was medieval. It proved that one specific corner of the shroud dated to the medieval period. Whether that corner represented the original cloth or a later repair remains, to this day, an open question that has never been resolved. In 2015, Italian geneticist Gianni Barcaccia and his team at the University of Padua published a study in Scientific Reports, a journal published by Nature. They had extracted and sequenced DNA from dust particles vacuumed from the Shroud during conservation work in 1977 and 1988. What they found should not have been possible on a cloth supposedly created in medieval France. The plant DNA told one story. 19 different species were identified, including plants native to the Mediterranean, Central Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Asia, and the Americas. The geographic range of these botanical traces was so vast that it could only be explained by the cloth having traveled extensively across multiple continents over a very long period of time. But the human DNA told a far stranger story. The team sequenced human mitochondrial DNA from the dust samples and identified sequences belonging to haplogroups from across the known world. Western European lineages were present, as expected from centuries of handling by European clergy and restorers. Mixed in with those expected signatures were genetic markers from populations that had no obvious reason to be concentrated on a single piece of cloth. Over 55% of the human DNA corresponded to lineages from the Near East. Nearly 39% matched haplogroups typical of the Indian subcontinent. There were traces from North Africa, from East Africa, from populations in the Caucasus region. One of the most abundant haplogroups was H33, a lineage typical of the Druze community, an ethnic group with roots in Egypt that lives primarily in restricted areas between Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. The oldest DNA fragments, the shortest and most degraded sequences that indicate the greatest antiquity, came predominantly from Indian lineages. Barcaccia suggested this pointed to the possibility that the linen itself was manufactured in India before making its way to the Middle East, a conclusion that aligned with historical records of fine Indian linen being traded to the Temple of Jerusalem for priestly garments. Then, in 2026, Barcaccia's team published a follow-up study analyzing material from the 1978 STURP sample collection. Using next-generation sequencing technology that was orders of magnitude more powerful than what had been available a decade earlier, they identified DNA from at least 14 different individuals. They found microorganisms from human skin. They found halophilic archaea, microbes that thrive exclusively in extremely saline environments like those near the Dead Sea. They found fungal communities consistent with centuries of storage in diverse climatic conditions. The genetic diversity was so extreme, so geographically dispersed, and so inconsistent with any model of simple contamination from European handling that the researchers were forced to a blunt conclusion. The DNA evidence is compatible with the cloth having traveled through the Near East and the Mediterranean over a period far exceeding what the 1988 carbon dating suggested. Barrie Schwortz has spent 46 years maintaining the world's largest repository of scientific data on the Shroud of Turin through his website Shroud.com. He has reviewed every paper, every study, every analysis that has ever been conducted on the cloth. He has been careful throughout his entire career to distinguish between evidence and belief. He presents data. He does not tell people what to think, but when the DNA results came through, something shifted. Schwartz had watched the 1988 carbon dating nearly destroy serious Shroud research overnight. He had spent decades explaining to dismissive journalists that the image properties remained unexplained regardless of the dating result. He had endured being called a believer, a crank, a man who could not let go, by people who had never spent 5 minutes examining the actual scientific data, and now the DNA was saying what the image properties had been saying since 1978. This cloth did not behave like a medieval European artifact. The genetic material on its surface told the story of a journey through the ancient Near East, through populations and environments that a cloth created in 14th century France should never have encountered. Schwartz described the moment carefully. After 46 years, he said the evidence does not support dismissing the Shroud as a medieval forgery. The image properties cannot be explained. The carbon dating has unresolved methodological problems. And now the DNA analysis suggests genetic material from populations and environments that do not fit a medieval European origin. He paused. Then he said what he had been holding back for decades. He was careful to say that he was not claiming this is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. He said that the scientific evidence, physical, chemical, and now genetic, does not fit conventional explanations. Something about this cloth is extraordinary. We need to be honest about that, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Here is the situation as it stands today. The Shroud of Turin bears an image that no scientific team has ever replicated. It contains three-dimensional spatial data encoded in a two-dimensional surface. It behaves as a photographic negative, 5 centuries before photography existed. The blood on the cloth has been confirmed as real human blood, type AB. The image exists in a layer thinner than a bacterium, with no pigment, no paint, no dye, no stain, no substance of any kind deposited on the surface. The 1988 carbon dating placed it in the medieval period, but the sample came from the most compromised corner of the cloth, and subsequent chemical analysis has demonstrated that the sample was not representative of the whole. The DNA analysis shows genetic material from populations spanning the Near East, India, North Africa, and Europe, with the oldest fragments pointing to origins far older than the medieval period. Halophilic microbes consistent with storage near the Dead Sea have been identified. The genetic diversity is incompatible with simple contamination from European handling, and not a single researcher at any institution using any technology available in 2026 has been able to explain how the image was formed. Schwortz has called for new research, new carbon dating from the center of the cloth, away from the contaminated edges, using multiple dating methods for cross-validation, advanced DNA extraction from the blood-stained areas with modern contamination controls, comprehensive chemical analysis using instruments that did not exist in 1978, and image formation experiments that attempt to reproduce all of the Shroud's properties simultaneously, not just one or two in isolation. The technology exists to answer these questions definitively. What is lacking is access. The cloth is controlled by the Archdiocese of Turin. New sampling requires Vatican approval, and in the decades since 1988, that approval has not been granted. The questions are too important to leave unanswered, Schwartz has said. Whether you are religious or not, whether you believe the Shroud is authentic or not, an artifact with these characteristics deserves serious scientific investigation. Barrie Schwortz is now 79 years old. He has spent nearly half a century on a single artifact. He went to Turin as a skeptic. He is still, in many ways, a skeptic. He questions everything. He demands evidence. He does not accept claims without data. But after 46 years, after the STURP examination, after the carbon dating controversy, after the DNA analysis, after watching every attempt to explain the image fail, after seeing genetic sequences on the cloth that point to a journey through the ancient Near East rather than a workshop in medieval France, Schwartz has arrived at a position he never expected to occupy. The Shroud is not solved. It is not debunked. It is not a closed case. It is the single most studied artifact in human history, examined by some of the most capable scientific minds of the past 5 decades, and after all of that scrutiny, it remains genuinely unexplained. The image should not exist by any conventional mechanism. The 3-dimensional data should not be encodable in a 2-dimensional surface. The photographic negative should not predate photography by 500 years. The DNA should not contain genetic markers from populations spanning 3 continents and multiple millennia, and yet all of it does. A Jewish photographer walked into a cathedral in Turin in 1978 expecting to document a forgery. He walked out with evidence that refused to fit any explanation he or anyone else has ever been able to offer. And he has spent every year since then trying to make sense of what he saw. He still cannot, and neither can anyone else. What do you think is actually on that cloth? Why do you think the Vatican has refused to allow new testing for nearly 4 decades? Tell me in the comments. If you want to know the moment new DNA results surface, or new access to the Shroud is granted, subscribe and turn on notifications because this one is far from over.